And good morning to you, Dakin. It's great to have you on Design and Dialogue.
Morning.
So I'm going to take a wild guess that you're not in the Noguchi Museum because the Noguchi Museum does not have ceiling fans.
It's true, sadly.
So where are you zooming in from?
Vermont at the moment.
Great. So peace and quiet up there, I would imagine.
A little bit, yes. And my family has vacated, fortunately, so there's enough bandwidth to make this work.
Okay. And speaking of peace and quiet, we're going to be talking about the Noguchi Museum, which is not actually open to the public at the moment, although as we'll get to right at the end of the conversation, you've been doing some interesting thinking about that condition. But how does it feel to be away from the museum for so long?
Oh, it hurts. It's physically painful. You and I have joked about this in the past. So those of us who work there, I think, have incorporated it into our way of being, and it's very hard. I have Phantom Museum syndrome, for sure. We're ready to get back in there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully that'll happen sooner rather than later. But we're going to have an amazing, and actually for our series, a somewhat unusual experience here because, Dakin, you're going to take us through a kind of light speed version of the history of Isamu Noguchi's involvement in design in various different genres of design as well. So you can go ahead and start the images, I guess.
Okay.
And we have a huge amount to get through because Noguchi was had a very long career and was very prolific, and design in some ways informed everything that he did. So please take it away.
Yeah, this is going to be the Isamu Noguchi version of a dialogue, which is like monologue. And it's going to be a little bit of a fire hose. Glenn will break in hopefully at any time, and we'll have time hopefully for questions at the end. So art, design, whatever. Noguchi hated being stereotyped and pigeonholed, and that really played a major role in his work in quote unquote design, which really didn't mean anything to him, as we'll get into. I'm just going to read this. Critics have always tried to pigeonhole him, the artist himself says, and the effort drives him as close to shouting as the quiet man gets. Why do critics get so upset? Art can be whatever moves people. Why does it have to be in these categories, he asks. I like what I do to be available. I don't care if anyone thinks it's art. Think of it as whatever. So that's a pretty good starting point for Noguchi's work in design. Now, Noguchi, from the very, very beginning, had an industrial mindset. There are a lot of reasons for that. He did learn carpentry in Japan as an elementary school student, and other kind of other hands-on work there as a young person. He had a hands-on mentality. He was interested in medical science. When he got back to New York, he very quickly made friends with Buckminster Fuller. That had a major effect on his thinking. Also, he very early on understood what was sort of natural to America. If he wanted to make something that was contemporary, that was part of contemporary culture, and America at that time was beginning this climb, becoming the kind of the premier industrial democracy. So that was always there. So here are two early pieces he made in Paris. The one on the left is a piece, and then its shadow is called Abstraction in Almost Discontinuous Tension, and it's just bent round bar. So it's the kind of thing that you would do in a metal shop, making the trim or for a fence or something like that. And on the right is a piece that he wanted to do in neon. It's called Powerhouse. So it's a kind of very early light work, unfortunately lost. Probably someday will show up hopefully will show up at a Paris flea market. Working in sheet metal from the very beginning, you can see these two pieces, positional shape on the left and lead on the right. These both have more in common with coach building than they do sort of common sculpture of the day. He made these while he was still working with Brancusi. He worked as a studio assistant for Brancusi. He was doing things like roughing out the bodies for Birds in Space. But it's really important, I think, to realize that he had this basic mindset of working with industrial materials and industrial processes from the beginning. Here on the left is an image of the plaster original of Miss Expanding Universe. I always joke, we did a show and I compared her to a hood ornament. I want to do a show about that at one point, because in the first quarter of the century, many of the best hood ornaments for the major coach builders, the luxury coach builders, were made by well-known sculptors. people like companies like Rolls-Royce and Bugatti hired well-known sculptors to make their hood ornaments, and many of them are in this form, the kind of the flying Venus, Nike, that kind of imagery. And this is the context is so important. It's on the cover of Buckminster Fuller's Shelter magazine. So she's a representative of a kind of cultural engagement. She has a significance in terms of the built environment. She's not an isolated piece of sculpture. And you can see she's been shot as if she's a spaceship, which is also incredibly interesting. And then on the right, Noguchi, many people kind of know this or they're back in the mind, but was a kind of sculptural amanuensis to Buckminster Fuller. So Bucky had the idea for the Dymaxion car, and the idea was maximum aerodynamic shaping. But Noguchi is the one who actually did the shaping. So Noguchi made the models of the Dymaxion car for Bucky. And that also had a major impact on the way he thought about what sculpture was for.
Hey, Dakin,
yeah.
Can I just interrupt quickly and ask, at this early stage, do you feel like Noguchi had peers who were equally broad-minded and equally interested in industrial processes that were brought to both sculpture and to these other contexts?
Not really, not that he knew, not artists. I mean, the one person that where there's some overlap and then he had a lifelong relationship with and a kind of an ongoing testy familial relationship was Sandy Calder. But what Noguchi's version of that story is that when he was making things like that abstraction and almost discontinuous tension, and was making things that were essentially mobiles, the Calder told him he was crazy. He was then also one of the participants in Calder's circus, and that Calder then later obviously went on to make the mobile a major part of his work. But and Sandy was using industrial materials, or would go on to use industrial materials and processes to some extent. And then people like David Smith, of course, it became quite common. But Noguchi was doing it. But what's so different or interesting is that Noguchi was doing it while he was working in the cathedral of direct carving and a direct tie and that truth to materials and all of that. But while he was doing that, he was also pursuing this other avenue. And that's 1927, 28. So it's actually, it's pretty early. But he was looking at things like, I would say the influence there, one of the influences, he was looking at the constructivists. So more than Bauhaus, he wasn't really impacted directly by Bauhaus. He got it indirectly through the constructivists, who were showing in Paris and were visible in Paris. So he was looking at things like, he was looking at paintings and works on paper more than he was seeing sculpture, but he did see them in magazines, in French magazines. They were being published to some extent. So he had that in the back of his mind, even though those were positioned as material experiments rather than works of art, but they were being made by people who were artists or acknowledged as artists in many cases. But again, he didn't really care about those categories. So he's somebody who was taking it all in. He really was a material culture person, not an art design person, as we'll talk about and get into.
Right.
We just got to show this because the one thing that we're not doing, because we're kind of focusing on objects a little bit, which really wasn't his main thing. He was really about spaces and shaping space, public consciousness through public space. And he always said, in the end for him, it all goes back to Play Mountain. So this is the first play space that he proposed for New York City. And as he said, when he presented this to Robert Moses, all he did was earn his undying enmity. And he would go on to try to make 4 different playgrounds in New York City, one per decade, basically through the 60s, the last with Louis Kahn. That was a 6-year collaboration that failed in the end, a major source of frustration for him. But Noguchi's idea, this is Noguchi's idea of design. I think in the end, Noguchi's absolute favorite metaphor for what he believes sculpture should be was the garden. And the play space is sort of a subset of that. So this was to be one city block somewhere in New York City. And you can see it's a step pyramid. It has built-in terracing, slide, pool, performance space. It was meant to be all season. So like the slide would be a snow sledding hill in the winter and could be a water sliding hill in the summer. But, you know, absolutely amazing thing. This is 1932-33. And as he said, sculpture can be a vital force in our everyday life as projected into communal usefulness. That's a great Noguchi phrase, projected into communal usefulness. And it explains why he was interested in things like this. So, you know, we just a few years back sort of brought this case to life as a Noguchi design. I should mention, very important for people who are really interested in Noguchi design, there's really only one significant study out there, and it's Deborah Goldberg's thesis, and it only goes up through 1940. Some of you probably know Debbie. She's a New York City critic, writer, curator, and her doctoral thesis was about Noguchi design. And then she wrote a sort of a very short version of it for an essay for a catalog that we did for a show at St. John's out in Queens. And she's the one who sort of brought this to light as a Noguchi design. So the interesting thing about this comparison is that it brings up, we're going to try to focus on principles and sort of the concepts that motivated Noguchi. So the case for the clock, the timing clock, this is the first commercially available timer clock for the kitchen, like for your home, for home use. It was based on the mechanicals of a timing clock for factory use. And Noguchi's sort of surrogate father and mentor, Edward Rumley, bought this company in Iowa called Hawkeye Timing and moved it to LaPorte, Indiana, and renamed it Measured Time. And then he hired his sort of, you know, son to design a case. The thing is that he did not let Noguchi model it. Noguchi drew it, and then they created it, which Noguchi was extremely frustrated about it, but he was a young person, and okay, fine, he did it. But it turned, this is in Bakelite, and it's actually a very complex thing. If you buy one of these and take it apart, you'll see just how complex the case itself is. It was very expensive to produce. So this was kind of a high-end item. And they wanted to do a lower price point version. So Rumley came back to him. Again, remember the relationship between these two people. Rumley was responsible for every commission that Noguchi got for 15 years, the first 15 years of his career. He came back and said to Noguchi, and we have the letters both ways, he said very tentatively, could you maybe perhaps just think about maybe a simplified version, like maybe a box, like square-ish? And Noguchi writes this letter back saying, no, anybody can make you a box. What you need to do is to let me model it and make it even better, because I know I can improve this one. And Rumley wasn't willing to do that, so that sort of went by the wayside. But what Noguchi learned from doing that was that in doing these things, what mattered to him was sculpting them. You know, he wanted to shape them, and for him, Noguchi was absolutely a Raphael Disegno guy. He was all about connecting the eye, the hand, and the imagination, and that he really believed those three things are all necessary to really make it work. And you see that in the case that he designed for Radio Nurse. So Zenith, which was really the Apple of its day, they hired him, and he worked directly with the president, who was an engineer, who himself designed the radio mechanism that made this monitoring system work. He just got Noguchi to do this case on Rumley's recommendation. And so he made this just extraordinary thing, which obviously has received a huge amount of attention and is very popular and has ended up in lots of exhibitions, became a kind of one of the milestones of the machine age in design, also Bakelite.
Dakin, do we know what Noguchi's thoughts were on plastic itself as a material? Obviously very progressive at that time. And
it's complicated. Bakelite he liked quite a bit. Bakelite has a lot of variation to it. You know, when you look at these Radio Nurse cases, if you see a lot of them, there's a huge variety of colors and textures and the kind of marbling in them. And, you know, I think for Noguchi, it was all about whether he could connect with the material and figure out what it was good at. I don't think he ever really truly felt that he found the spirit of plastic. He did make a whole line of lamps in plastic in the 40s for Lightelier. They were made to order. We don't think anybody ordered them. They were advertised in magazines. Again, those might be out there in flea markets and garage sales in Cleveland. Who knows? we've never seen one in person. We have one prototype in fiberglass, but they were meant to be produced in plastic. And he did use plastic in some of his works, but he didn't make it a sort of a mainline material for work. This is something that was never produced. This is an extraordinary thing, a musical weather vane. Noguchi, because he went to high school in Indiana, he considered himself a Hoosier. One of the main Hoosier values is the idea of domestic efficiency. I think, Hoosier housewives were famous for making improvements to things, improving cabinets, improving latches, improving chairs, improving everything around the home. And that's something that Noguchi really took to heart. He considered himself a Hoosier in that sense his whole life. Here, he really wanted to change the entire landscape of the rural Midwest. He wanted these to be on the roof of every barn. And so not only was it musical in that wind would blow through these gills, but every one of these also is internally lit. So it's wired and has a light bulb on the inside of it. So the idea was to change the very nature of the call of home. That you look up and your barn has this sort of singing beacon on the top of it. It's an extraordinary idea, and never ended up getting produced. He made many prototypes, and then weirdly they survived into the 60s. They show up in color photos of the studios in the 60s, but we don't have one, sadly. There are a number of these wonderful drawings, which you can see on the left of them. This is the thing that inspired that, and this is another really good example of getting at sort of Noguchi's principles. Noguchi really was in love with technology, but the difference is for Noguchi, technology wasn't what was new. Technology is what was good. And so he was interested in the sort of bleeding edge of technology from 10,000 years ago, the bleeding edge of technology from 500 years ago, the bleeding edge of technology from sub-Saharan Africa and from the subcontinent and from China and everywhere and anywhere else. So here's a really interesting example. We have one of these. The only reason we know what it is that the Met happens to have one and had written a good label about it. This is, and I am not kidding, this is a pigeon tail whistle. So these whistles were attached to the tails of pigeons. And this was a way that you could, for example, identify your homing pigeon coming back in. You would know that it was on the way back into your house by the sound of your whistle on its tail. Completely crazy thing, but he said explicitly that it had an effect on his thinking in putting together the musical weather vane.
It might be worth just one more word on the issue of technology. So of course that word has the Greek techne, which can be also translated craft. And I think it's really important just to dwell on the fact that Noguchi respected technology as not a distinctively modern thing, but as a distinctively human thing and something that occurred in different historical contexts, different geographical contexts.
Absolutely, and not just not modern, but not Western.
Right.
So he was interested in all techne. That is the good way to think about it. All true craft. And the craft. So he would say for its time, you go to a museum and where does a cycladic idol belong? If you think about that sort of mid-century approach to primitive art and being Western artists being inspired by primitive arts from various places, Noguchi would say that the cycladic idol is an example of sort of the epitome of technology at its best. It's not a primitive object. It's a supremely technological object, if you look at it. And the proof of that is that it's still working. It still does effectively exactly what it did 3,000 years ago and works across the globe. Those things are impactful for an incredibly wide range of people over an extraordinarily long period of time. What's a better proof of technology than that?
Yeah, I think it's just a great point because it's one of the most attractive things about Noguchi in retrospect, at least to me. And beyond Noguchi specifically, I think also that way of looking at questions of knowledge and expertise and form seems so much more compatible with contemporary global understandings of value than the other version of primitivism, where you had a kind of strip mining of African sculpture, for example, by Picasso, et cetera, et cetera. And Noguchi's way of going at that whole set of questions really through design, or what we might call design. And this idea of technology or techne seems so much more illuminated.
Totally. Now, by the way, he did write a very interesting article about primitivism. The art's called Primitive in quotation marks. And he was, in a lot of ways, incredibly progressive for his time. He was still a product of various eras. And it's very important, too, with Noguchi to remember, he worked in 8 different decades over 60 years. His views changed, his opinions changed, just like ours have. He was, he was a dyed-in-the-wool assimilationist. He believed in the American ideal at its best. So there are issues. And he does defend Western artists' interest in African art. And he was an appropriator himself. But it's the way that he did it and the way that he thinks about it that I think makes him more sympathetic and more in line with contemporary approaches and contemporary thinking. It's why he still seems like a model and an avatar and not sort of unsavable at this point, unsalvageable dinosaur the way Picasso does.
Yeah. Well, let's now move to choreography, super interesting topic, his collaborations with Martha Graham.
Yeah, so I think we have to acknowledge the sets. They're incredibly important, in large part because they are, in a way, well, the work from Martha Graham, which for a long time he viewed as a kind of an ancillary sideline, and then only after about 30 years realized it was actually the heart and soul of everything that he cared about, and had come to completely define and redefine his thinking about what sculpture could and should be. It's sort of typical of him. Everything, it's another reason why we love Noguchi so much, because everything that is other, ancillary, outside, tangential, ends up being central and key and foundational. So this is the very first set that he made for Martha Graham. It's for Frontier. It's incredibly simple. It's just a length of rope and a split rail fence. And it's meant to symbolize the frontier, the American West. It's also such a wonderful sculptural nod towards one-point perspective, which it plays with. And when it's properly installed on a stage, a proscenium stage, the rope goes off stage right and left. So the perspective is infinite. So here you are, Martha Graham, standing in one specific point on the earth, but she's connected to the whole universe. And nothing is more Noguchi than that. And doing it with this incredible economy of means. This is Martha's first set. Martha, in sort of completely redefining or defining for the first time a modernist dance, one of Martha's key moves was to start out by having no sets, no program notes. She did her own costumes, which were incredibly simple. And then she gradually, obviously, layered in other components. And Noguchi sets were really primary in that. But for Noguchi, one of the key things here was that these are objects, they're sculpture, but they're made for use. And that was so fantastic and so exciting to him, because these are things that are specifically meant to engage with the body, and they're meant to motivate action. And they're meant to create, again, with very few things, create entire universes. And what was so good, or why their collaboration worked so well, by the way, they collaborated mostly by not talking, because they're both incredibly difficult, prickly people. So she really didn't discuss program with him very much. She did it with much easier going people, like usually her composers and others. And by the way, she's a genius when it comes to program. She would write a 10-page praesis for an upcoming dance. And those are wonderful things to read if you go into archives to read them. And Noguchi would get to read them, but they didn't talk very much. But what he was good at was sort of limiting what she wanted in a very, very general sense, and then making components for her that weren't directive in any way. Like when we talk about his playground design, non-directive, anti-authoritarian, and his sets were very much the same way. So they don't say, use me this way, or you have to use me this way. They presented her with like an incredible range of options and inspiration. And then she would really reshape the dances without changing the program, reshape the dances around the objects, the sets and props that he provided her. And we're still messing with these today. So we're going to have a set made because that's another interesting thing about them, is that the company has the right to make performance copies. So they keep making them, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're terrible. And we make them too occasionally. We make exhibition copies of things that we don't have, or things wear out. So we're currently, Martha Graham just had these two made, which are new fences, and we're getting a set made as well. Really fun thing to be involved with, and trying to make sure that you kind of are in the, you can't get exactly right. You've just got to be in the ballpark and make sure that you're above the threshold and that it flips whatever switch it's supposed to flip. So here, we're going to look really quickly at one specific set because I think it's a really good way to understand how permeable the categories were for him. This is a composite of the Cave of the Heart set. On the left, the islands; in the middle, the sort of aorta, big island, and then on the right, the serpent and the spider dress. And to look at those a little bit more specifically, these are all performance copy examples, but you can see what's amazing about them is the range of materials and the range of approaches and techniques. So the islands are basically just little chunks of concrete, cement, over a little bit of burlap and wood structure. And they're quite clever because they have a hinge, just an off the rack door hinge in the base, so that they can be flipped up and screwed to the floor of the theater and then flipped down so they won't move, because Jason has to stride across these as a sort of conquering hero. And by the way, the islands, they're so brilliant. If you haven't seen Cave of the Heart, you should, because it is such an amazing way to satirize Jason as this kind of buffoon. Because it's always, especially with Martha, always has big, beefy leading men. She loves big, strong guys. So they look absolutely ridiculous, bestriding Greece as they do when they're walking across these little sort of Japanese pond stepping stones. And then you have aorta at the center, which is a big piece of paper mache, basically. It's plaster over lath and wood and chicken wire. And then on the right, the spider dress is this incredible thing of just bent brass wire, bent and welded brass wire. And the serpent itself was molded modeled out of magnesite, which is this material that Noguchi was excited about at the time. Turned out to be a terrible material, but he made a bunch of things out of it. It was a commercial competitor to concrete that failed because it never sets. So it never stops interacting with the environment, which is the last thing that you want. So they tend to eat themselves alive. They're very bad in moisture, and they remain chemically active. This is not that. This is a performance copy that was made in fiberglass. It's really interesting, and it's an example of a bad one, because you can see that somebody asked to make it, looked at the original and said, hey, that doesn't look like very much like a snake. And they tried to make it look a lot more like a snake. And they even have the one that Martha used for a long time actually had a little red tongue painted on it, which was not a Noguchi element. That's sort of just transitioning. So here's a Martha Graham dancer in a very classic Martha Graham laid back kick pose, which I like a lot because it's a nice lead into the Goodyear table, which is the first of these one-of-a-kind tables that Noguchi made for presidents of MoMA. He made one-of-a-kind tables for 3 MoMA presidents in a row, and a lot of others for other people. He would do sort of custom interiors, make you a chandelier and a coffee table and a dining table and some chairs. So this one has become well known just because of the auction a few years ago, where Noguchi design and sculpture markets have crossed at times, very interestingly, where the one-of-a-kind furniture objects were getting insane prices at auction, as this one did. But the interesting thing about it, so it's a stack laminated table. He did the stack laminate himself. It's rosewood, and it's articulated, so it has a joint, and the 2 elements move. And then it became the progenitor, ultimately, of the Herman Miller coffee table. So here's a picture of it from Phillips when it went up at auction. A really nice interior Stoller shot of the house that it was made for. So it was made for a specific house in collaboration with the architect for Conger Goodyear. And you can see it's like all great Noguchi tables, it's incredibly awkward. Every Noguchi table is somehow messing with the standard form factors. So not quite coffee table, not quite console table, not quite dining table, everything is semi-something, or sort of something, or somewhat something. Those are all words that Noguchi used and loved enormously: somewhat, semi, and sort of. So he never designed a Japanese garden. He made somewhat Japanese gardens. And this is a somewhat console table that also functions as a somewhat coffee table, depending on your setup.
So that's part of the whateverness, I guess.
It's very part of whatever. Yeah, no, he's always trying to defeat expectation and defeat the categories. That's why I made him so frustrated when, so here, this is, I think I found the actual ad that Noguchi mentioned when he said, so he was hired by Rev John Givings to design a biomorphic coffee table. Rev John Givings had seen the Goodyear table somehow and was excited about it. It was a big deal doing the industrial plate glass top. We didn't talk about that, but he actually went himself to Pittsburgh to have the top cut at the premier plate glass, industrial plate glass company. And the coolest thing about the table today, the original Goodyear table, is that you can both see the crimp marks in the glass top because it was moved the way that you usually move industrial glass. So it was actually cramped with spike clamps, and those spike marks are still in the glass. And it also has the tempered tag on it because it was tempered glass. So by law, it had to be marked as tempered. And that's there too. So it's like a car windshield, only it's being used as a tabletop. So this is the Rev John Givings one. So Givings hired him. Then Noguchi heard nothing else about it. He went into the internment camp. Somehow he got a hold of a magazine and saw an ad in a magazine for the table that he had designed for Rev John Givings. I think this is the ad on the left, and then there's a table on the right. These are very well known. You can buy them if you want one, but you have to do that knowing that the design was stolen from Noguchi. He was so angry that he went off and decided to try to design a table that would eclipse it, and that's what became the Herman Miller coffee table, which, for better and worse now, whatever your interior, this this works, or it counts as, fits your style, whatever your style may be. Here are two pretty good, flashy, generic, and weird interiors. Even spawned, as some of you may know, this famous blog, Fuck Your Noguchi Coffee Table, which is a kind of a hate design blog that's actually very clever and very funny. It's not just about Noguchi coffee tables, it's about all of the cliches of contemporary interior design. But the Noguchi coffee table is the very first one. This is just a great image of it and sort of gets at what Noguchi was after. He was very good about the photographers that he worked with and understood, as all great sculptors do, that sculptors need photographers in a way that painters don't. And this gets at part of what Noguchi was interested in. He and George Nelson were so simpatico. Nelson wrote a brilliant essay that you can find in collections about the subscape. Nelson was fascinated by everything below the tabletop level because it had been so neglected in design. And here Noguchi is, of course, making that totally visible. This is the skeleton of a table. And that's all it is. It's just the skeleton of a table.
It's very reminiscent maybe of Eero Saarinen's pedestal tables, the tulip tables.
Absolutely. Yeah, same basic ideas, to feature what hadn't been in the past and making it more sculptural, whatever that means. Lots of other tables. We don't have really time to go through them, but the rudder table, the fin table, the made-to-order marble coffee tables. These also are obviously highly sought after. We don't know how many were made. We don't know how many Noguchi made himself. He surely made some of them himself, but they're totally magical things. This is the famous Dretzen coffee table, which is the first one to really make a big splash at auction, 4 million or something. One of a kind fossil marble coffee table. We did an installation at Pace Gallery in 2015 called Table Not Table, which was trying to combine all of these both commercial and sculptural sort of typologies that play around with the idea of table as landscape, as mesa, and all the other kinds of different ways. In the foreground, you can see this one, which I adore, which is a kind of like a garden piece. Is maybe meant to catch water and then flow water down in kind of a fall off the right-hand side. Just interesting to see them all together. This was a huge fight. And right up to the very end, Arnie wanted to take this apart. And then when he finally saw it all together, He had refused to allow us to include the Herman Miller coffee table in it because he thought it would cheapen the rest of it, too commercial. But in the end, he liked it so much that he went and got the Herman Miller coffee table out of his own office and let us put that one in because it was nearby.
Can I just editorialize for 1 second?
Yeah.
Just to say that arc that you just took us on with the table, where you began with that amazing comparison between the Martha Graham dancer and her outflung leg, which so resembles the form of the undercarriage of the coffee table. And then eventually we get to the idea of the coffee table being really a cliche. So fuck your Noguchi coffee table. There is something there about also the way design functions, in the sense that he really began with an idea of a kind of heightened use. So the idea that the domestic object like the Conger Goodyear table could be like a prop for a certain kind of imaginative occupation of the space, the same way that a choreography would be. But
Yes.
that design gets absorbed and maybe becomes banal over time, almost no matter how progressive or radical it is at first exposure. And I wonder whether Noguchi actually had ideas about that, about the way that his designs lived out in space once they were released into the wild.
Well, I think he loved that. I mean, that's the projected into communal usefulness.
Yes.
So the whole idea was to shape our consciousness by shaping our spaces, and he did believe that objects could shape our spaces. What better space to shape than domestic interiors, where we spend the vast majority of our time, and to do it in a way so that the more of us can afford it. No, I think he was incredibly proud of what the Herman Miller coffee table had achieved. The fact that it became a kind of cliche. You know, there's that joke, the Marcel Duchamp joke about the staircase, woman descending staircase, which is, somebody asked him about it, and he said, I don't even see her anymore. She's become so absorbed and become so much of a cliche that she stopped existing for him. And in some sense, that's true, but that represents victory. He hated decoration. He hated the idea of sculpture as decoration. I actually think that's in this quote that I'm showing right now, right at the bottom in parentheses. I've always disliked the use of art as decoration. So, I think that the idea that coffee table could be the sun around which so many different kind of interiors spin, orbit, that is what he was after.
Mm.
That was the goal. That is success for sure. So as he says here, I'll just really quickly, the unique freestanding sculpture is the consecration of a private image that inhabits its own space, which is not easily related to any other. Its place is ideally that imaginary void of the mind, a museum or garden for private communion. To this I am dedicated, but I have wanted at the same time, perhaps because of my somewhat alien situation, to bring sculpture into a more direct involvement with the common experience of living. So there it is. There's the answer right there. And here's a really good example. So very important in Noguchi's work are these table pieces. And I showed some of those in the table, not table, as you can see, but there were a lot, and they're an incredibly significant part of his overall sculptural work. This is a really nice one, really nice example that's now in the Nelson Atkins. It's a centerpiece of their custom designed Noguchi courtyard. We sold them all of the works for that courtyard that are part of the Stephen Hall expansion there. It's called Nightland. This is a wonderful, surreal tablescape, mindscape, imaginary space. Noguchi have lots of different terms for them. The interesting thing about it is that it started out as in a table format. So it had 3 legs and sat flat. And Eleanor Ward used it as a table in her gallery. So this is where like the brochures for her current show would be placed, and people use it as a table. They put their drinks down on it, and then Noguchi ended up lopping off one of the legs and putting it at an angle, and that's what it became and now is. But it still has latent in it that use as an actual table, and it was sold when it was sold as a table initially. And there's a very direct relationship here. We did a show called Design into Art, where what we wanted to demonstrate was that for Noguchi, almost always his sculptural innovations, in big air quotes, came out of design work. And again, that Noguchi didn't believe in hierarchy and hierarchy of arts and design. And remember, in Japan, those are totally flipped. In many other cultures, they're totally flipped. Craft is at the top. and fine art, if it even exists, is somewhere else. So here's a wonderful piece, The Seed. It was very famously, very sadly broken at one point, but what's neat about that is you can see it all laid out flat when it's broken in the crate. And what it makes you realize is that the extent to which Noguchi thought as an industrial designer. He thought in terms of parts and thought in terms of flat materials. This is a worksheet for sculpture. So this is an actual worksheet on graph paper, making the templates, the little templates for interlocking sculpture. This would become figure, which we'll see in just a minute. But in terms of sort of going back to that, drawing on traditional crafts for the technology to make the things that he made, here's a really excellent example. This is an article from Life magazine that shows the rocking stool for Noel in this case, which is an incredibly complex thing because of the wire form. So the top doesn't sit on the base. This is designed like a bicycle wheel. So the top and the base are held together by the wires, and they're able to support a certain amount of weight. But it's the opposite of what you think. It's through tension that they exert on each other. It's a really interesting thing. But in terms of the format, it's based on this Nigerian market stool, this Liga market stool, which he adored. Noguchi would frequently say things like, well, of course, eventually there'll be no furniture at all, as if that were like what we aspire to. So in that mold, fewer legs is better. Like if you can make a chair, you have a chair with 4 legs, okay, that's great. If you can make it with 3 legs, that's better. If you can do 1 leg, that's better still. And he loved 1-point seating things, where your legs are the other 2 points. He just found this much more flexible and much more interesting. So from his point of view, this Liga market stool is like, again, is the height of technology. Also, it's called a fidget stool because it has a rounded bottom. So for people who are fidgety or spend all day sitting in market, it still allows you to move and keep active. We did a little show, I'll blow through this really quickly, that's still up, ironically, although nobody is seeing it at the moment, and it will remain up for a while so you can come see it, about Noguchi's efforts to design what he called the perfect ashtray. And in the end, none of these ashtrays ever went into production, but we have produced, we've discovered this based on an amazing article written by a design and architecture writer, somebody quite well known named Mary Mix, who we think wrote an article on spec for one of George Nelson's design magazines. He was hired by Time Life to come up with ideas for 3 or 4 new design magazines. And he was just too busy, so it never happened, even though he had a startup office of 3 or 4 people. And we think that he commissioned a bunch of spec articles to show what they could do. So Mary Mix spent a couple of months following Noguchi as he tried to create the perfect ashtray. And in the end, he did come up with, in the course of the article, which is worth reading, you can read it online on our archives, he designed 2 like diametrically opposed, very Noguchi designs. The first one is like sort of biomorphic. It's this crafted one on the left, and then this highly technological one on the right. After he finished the one on the left, he ended up saying, it's just, it just looks like any other ashtray. It's just too generic, even though it isn't. And then he said to her, if you're not doing something that takes advantage of America's industrial capacity, you're just wasting your time. So he came up with this one on the right. And we're showing that he submitted actually 3 design patents for different variations on these ideas, which he called this bullet design. It was meant to be disassemblable, very easy to clean, which is the big thing with ashtrays. So here we've actually 3D printed. We made models, CAD models, and then 3D printed examples of them so that we can actually see what he had in mind. It's a really fun little show. And it was quite brilliantly modular in Noguchi's way. That's another incredibly important Noguchi design principle, is modularity. So the little bullets just wired to each other were meant to be a kind of universal ashtray accessory. So you could take these and use them in this is a Russell Wright ashtray, the green one, that you see here, and we've just dropped into it one of Noguchi's little accessories. And then this is the disassemblable model. And then this one was meant to be totally modular. So the idea was that you would get magazines of these bullets, which you can see lined up here. It would be done in glass, and they would be multicolored. So the magazines would be done in different colors. So you could arrange your own ashtray to your own taste.
Mm.
Super fun. And then the only things that physically exist, it's a very confusing story, are these cast iron ashtrays, which exploded onto the market when one sold it right for $62,000 as a supposedly unique Noguchi design. And then, of course, they flooded out because everybody who had one came out, and they were made by Bonyers. You can see, so the process that Noguchi went through in designing the biomorphic ashtray, these are the 9 plaster models, and they're reproduced in the Mary Mix article. And surely there is a relationship. We don't know what it is, but we cannot say that these are autographed Noguchi design. But they still have a relationship to this process. I'm not going to read this just because we're running short, but you should go look at this interview that Noguchi gave, which is specifically, it's from 1949, and it's all about the sort of art and design thing, which is, all of us, I'm sure, spent a lot of time on that, but Noguchi had no interest in it whatsoever, and just circumvents that whole dichotomy between art and design, because he just didn't care at all about those categories. He was interested in what had an impact, again, on space and the shaping of mental space. I always think in terms of my mental furniture, like what makes it up? Where did it come from? How did I design the interior of my mind? And I think that's how Noguchi thought. So we're going to do super quick Akari. I did a couple of pictures because people always hear these things, but probably haven't pictured them. So Noguchi went to Gifu City to see the cormorant fishing. This is a completely insane festival in which cormorants are trained for 3 years to do this. There are only 6 cormorant fishers in the whole city, and the cormorants live with the fishermen. It's really mad. They tie ropes around the cormorant's neck because cormorants eat fish whole. They tie a rope around their neck and they can't swallow the fish. And then at night, they go out with these huge bonfire-y things which scare the fish. The fish jump out of the water, the cormorants catch them, and then the fishermen reel them back in and take the fish from them. It's a totally nuts thing. So Noguchi went to see this, and he met up with the governor of Gifu City. And then in Gifu is the center of paper lamp production. Most of it is for these ancestor festivals, these floating light festivals in the summer. And that's where their main business is. But it had fallen on hard times because of World War II. And they asked Noguchi, as a kind of semi-famous designer visiting, whether he had any ideas to help revive the industry by modernizing it. This is what a traditional chochin looks like, or one example of what they look like. Noguchi went away immediately, was incredibly excited by this, and designed 18 models, and really taking advantage of the innate capabilities of one particular family-run business that were very open to modernization. But the main thing was putting electric lights in them, which nobody had done. So it was marrying this 300-year-old technology, by the way, he thought was, again, the pinnacle of what was possible with these materials. The washi paper, what he said, it's a beautiful phrase. He said he didn't have to invent any technology. All he had to do was to deflect this existing technology, which had been developed over centuries of using the interior bark of the mulberry tree, which produces paper that, unlike cotton lead paper, is mechanically much more durable. You can expand it and contract it. And in Gifu City, what was unusual about their lanterns is that they're spiral lanterns. So it's one continuous rib of bamboo. And that means that the ribbing is structural. It doesn't just hold the paper. It actually creates structural strength, and it allows them to expand and contract much better and to retain their shape over a longer period of time.
I love the idea of the deflection of existing technology as a conception or even a definition of design. Can you just say where the word Akari comes from?
Akari just means light in Japanese. So it's like Kleenex. I mean, it's brilliant. He just was able to essentially trademark the idea of light, referring both to illumination and lightness, he was interested, obviously, with Akari in both. And then also he loved the ideogram, which is the sun and the moon, which we all know now from Akari branding. And he immediately went that sun and moon ideogram is very cosmic, very spacey, and that's immediately how he understood Akari and saw Akari. You can see here too a very early photographs of a 15A, which is one of the original 18, which were designed in the early 50s. And you can see this is how he was photographing them very early on. So seeing them as celestial objects of one sort or another, a sun or a moon on the left, that's a 100D, and the 1A. This is the second version of the 1A, where he broke free from the bamboo collars, top and bottom, and went to a total free form once he figured out how to do that with the bamboo ribbing and just a little bit of metal structure. But here you can see it looks like a little lunar lander. And again, this is before we had even been into space. This is pre-Sputnik.
Right.
And photographed lots of them that way, you know, dynamic, mysterious, celestial objects again. You can see the incredible variation in them, the incredible subtlety of them. These are the main three wind styles. The D, which is random wide wound, the A, which is very regular structured round, and then the F, which is the kind of oblong, somewhat irregular, but narrower, finer wind. I'm going to just move a little bit more quickly here to this, because this is the kind of the heart and soul of what Noguchi was about. You can imagine if you are one of these craftspeople in a family-run factory in Japan, and your job is to make the molds, the wood molds that the Akari lanterns are actually built around. So you get this package from Noguchi, and you open it up, and inside is one of these things that he's making on the left, which are these incredibly horrible styrofoam models. So Noguchi would take a big raw block of styrofoam, which is maybe the worst material that humanity has ever designed, maybe the evilest material that humanity has ever made. And he would carve it because it's lightweight, cheap, and carves like butter. So, and then really cheap to ship to Japan. He was incredibly frugal. So you would open up a box and get one of these things, and then you would have to make one of these molds that you see on the right from one of these styrofoam models. Oh, sorry. And Noguchi saw no, you know, for him, this is all just part and parcel. So for him, the craft of carving the styrofoam thing just flows perfectly smoothly and directly into the making of this incredibly complicated fin model, which is disassemblable. Because remember, once you form the lantern around it, the whole mold has to be removed from the hole at the top. So it's an amazing thing. That's part of the technology of Akari that was there just waiting for him. And it's what allowed him to create such unusual shapes with Akari ultimately, because you had these disassemblable molds that they were formed around. He, by the way, another very important Noguchi phrase, he called what he did with Akari and so many other things, the true development of an old tradition, which I think is a really beautiful way to think about appropriation, which is what it is.
It's like finding its essence and bringing it to its conclusion.
Yeah, it's like it's respectful engagement, you know, and taking it on its own terms and then trying to push it forward. I mean, I think Noguchi believed that the best way to respect a tradition was to try to perpetuate it, and was by trying to grow it into the future using contemporary ideas, contemporary technology, contemporary materials. Nothing worse than things encased in amber. He didn't believe that at all. Noguchi was a continuity person. So he wanted past, present, and future all to be one continuous horizon. With Akari, he was also incredibly compelled by and interested in the whole system. So the packaging, the collapsibility, the idea that you can have something as compelling as a 1 meter globe that packs down into a package that's an inch thick and only weighs a pound and could be shipped around the world for practically nothing. You know, I always joke, it's the perfect anti-sculpture, Akari. And I would argue that it is Noguchi, that the Akari economy, because it's also social sculpture, using that Joseph Boy's definition of social sculpture. Aside from maybe a few religious icons, Akari is the most ubiquitous sculpture on earth. So I would say it is Noguchi's most successful sculpture. I'm going to pass by this and show these. So we did it in this designed art show. We did a whole installation that was about flat packability, because that's a principle that Noguchi derived from Akari. We saw it with the Herman Miller coffee table here. So here one is broken down into its parts. And the same thing applied to the interlocking sculptures, which have been described as the perfect internment sculpture because they're disassemblable. If the thing about internment was you were only allowed to bring into the camps what you could carry yourself. So it was like 2 suitcases and whatever's on your back. Noguchi was making sculpture. This is wartime sculpture that can be taken apart, broken down, lashed together, and carried over the shoulder.
The kind of nomadic art.
Yeah, and he's not the only sculptor to do that. It's a really interesting story about wartime sculpture, is that sculptors always find a way to work with materials, because materials are almost all, the ones that you usually work with are going to the war effort.
Yeah.
So you make things smaller, you make them sort of guerrilla style, you make them with found materials, as Noguchi himself did as well. So this was the installation, that flat packable installation. But it's, again, it's such a fundamental, and it's such a fundamentally industrial idea that, as you can see in this installation, just bleeds into everything that Noguchi did. You know, it's not a sculptural idea, it's not a design idea, it's just an idea that Noguchi applied to everything because he believed in it, he was interested in it. And here as well with the prismatic table, which he designed as a prototype for Alcoa's forecast program, all about modularity. We're working with Vitra right now. So many years ago, we authorized Vitra to produce the prismatic table, but they did it in black and white, which is like the safe, generic design choice. And we approved that at the time. We're encouraging them now to go back and rethink and eliminate those ultimately, and go back to Noguchi's original idea, which was meant to be modular. So it's supposed to be a mosaic, not these kind of very safe monochromatic examples. Noguchi later did a design for the Osaka World's Fair in 1970, and part of his proposal was for what he called the people mosaic, which was an amazing interactive screen program that would have shown a kind of mosaic of humanity, which sadly was never made. But that idea, the mosaic, the prism, was one that was a sort of meaningful design notion for him. Then finally, I don't know, should we press forward and just quickly do? Okay.
Yeah.
So he made. I always joke. He really was not about discrete and autonomous aesthetic bonbons. He was not about serving the luxury object market. He didn't care about that at all. He did like the idea of getting rich. That's part of why he tried to design the perfect ashtray, because he knew that if that was off their earning income, that he could do whatever he wanted. And he mostly just wanted freedom, freedom from constraints. He, as he said, his whole life, he was his only client. He never really had a client. And if that was okay with his clients, then things went well. And if it wasn't okay with his clients, then he just walked away. But he always wanted what he did to be accessible and affordable and available. He hated the idea that he was making things that only the wealthy could salt away in their homes or their vaults or museums. He frequently talked about looking beyond what he called the false horizon of the museum pedestal. That is not his horizon. So he did this. Gemini was after him for years, and I gave a talk about this a few weeks ago for the museum, to work with them and do an edition. And they had done some sculpture. They'd done quite a bit of sculpture. They weren't really ready for what Noguchi came forward with. They did 2 initial ones in 78 and 80 that were very successful. So black and blue interior landscape on the left, pylon on the right. And on the basis of that, they asked them to maybe, they always do lots of editions with the people that they work with. That's one of the things they're great about, is digging really deep into an artist's work over long periods of time. So they asked Noguchi to do some more. So he came back to them with ideas for 26. But you can see he designed them the same way that he did those interlocking sculptures. So he would lay them out, flat materials. He always wanted to make sculpture, 3-dimensional things out of 2-dimensional materials. He said that, you know, having come out of Brancusi's studio, it always felt like cheating, but he was totally compelled by it. And remember too, he learned kirigami and origami as an elementary school child. So the idea of folding metal came very naturally to him. And he would make these little paper maquettes out of, so he'd draw on graph paper, cut out with an X-Acto knife, trace those onto cardstock, and make these little models, which are usually about 3 or 4 inches high. And then he would take those and they would sit here on the ground, and then he would freehand up onto foam core. And then those foam core models that he free cut with a blade would become the templates for cutting the sheet steel, which at the time was done with a plasma cutter. So they're much more rough and irregular. We fight to achieve that because they're cut with a laser and a computer, they're computer controlled. So they can make a perfect curve, but that's the opposite of what we want. We're still trying to achieve something that feels like plasma cutting. So he came back with 26 designs. For better or worse, Gemini agreed. And so I've just arranged them here so you can see a kind of a group of them. These are small, these are medium, and these are the largest of them. And they were very inexpensive when they began selling. They're big editions. So the small ones are in editions usually of 26 and the bigger ones of 18. And so we're still fabricating these today. They all legally exist, just not all of them have been made. So on the right, you can see what Noguchi was interested in. He was interested in the flow of time. He wanted these things to be barometers of change. He wanted them to actually exist in the world. And so he chose galvanized steel, which is just a roadside material, urban furniture, lampposts, guardrails. I've been running here in Vermont, and there's some really good guardrails. So I'm passing like one Noguchi every 3 feet with the posts for the guardrails. What's neat is, so the galvanized surface is actually, we think of it as bulletproof, like that's why we use it for lampposts. But the truth is that the galvanized steel changes immensely over time. So this is one that has developed over about 20 years. The thing about the zinc layer that forms on top of the steel is that it starts out with this shiny sheen on the top layer of it. So you can't see what it's done down below where it's bonded with the steel. But what happens when it bonds with the steel is it interacts individually, the galvanizing solution, the chemicals, interact directly with every one of the constituent elements of the alloy of steel. So what you're seeing here, all this flecking, you're looking at the structure of the alloy. So every one of these flecks is a complete crystal of an individual element: iron, nickel, copper, manganese, all of the things that go into an alloy of steel. It's fantastic. It's just like crystal formation in granite, except that here it happens in a millisecond instead of over 1 million years. And it's revealed by this process of galvanization. So, but when they come out of the vat, this is how they look. So this is one that we just produced. And you can see it's got this shiny surface. And by the way, that shiny surface, if you look at it funny, you mark it forever. It takes about 3 or 4 years, depending on conditions, for the very top layer of the galvanization to go transparent. It actually oxidizes and it forms a more protective layer. It calcifies, weirdly. And then when it becomes transparent, you can see what it's done underneath with the steel. And then you can beat them up, and they can take quite a lot of environmental abuse.
So interesting.
Again, so these things are inserted into the flow of time. They're meant to be units of change. You're buying something that's going to change and grow like a tree. It's like owning a plant.
So interesting, that deep relationship to stone, which of course was one of his preferred sculptural materials.
Yeah, and he was making these at exactly the same time that he was making the large late basalt works that now he's most known for, or most famous for, that are really the market works. And Arnie, again, I don't mean to pick on Arnie Glimcher at all, because obviously he's an extraordinary dealer and Noguchi loved and trusted him. But Arnie, as he says himself, spent his entire career trying to protect Noguchi the sculptor from Noguchi the designer. And when he started working with Noguchi, of course, that was smart. Strategically, that made sense, because to build the sculpture market, you had to somewhat isolate Noguchi the designer. What we're trying to do, of course, now is to put all of the Noguchi fragments back together, because that's where he's most interesting as a contemporary contrast. But Arnie hated these pieces because they were an alternative, a cheap alternative to the works in stone that Arnie was responsible for selling.
So Dakin, I wonder whether we should actually now move to questions, since we've done a pretty decent job of the Gemini G.E.L, but I know you have this one last beautiful thought about Noguchi's ultimate design, so maybe we could conclude with that.
Sure. Yeah, if it's not a slide, and maybe it is a slide, this is, you know, an amazing, obviously, when Noguchi represented the US at the Biennale in 1986, the slide on the right was the centerpiece of the show. It was a working slide. By the way, they had to pay people initially to slide down it because people were so conditioned against touching art. But they needed people sliding on it for press photos. So they actually paid kids to slide down the slide. But this is Noguchi himself preparing to slide down it at 82. This is an 80,000 pound working white marble slide. But people always ask, well, I'll just read this because it is great. Noguchi has become very sophisticated in matters of technology, engineering, and plumbing. In his museum, he also maintains tight control over his oeuvre and his image. The secret to his genius, however, is knowing when to impose his will and when to let nature take over. We saw that with the Gemini things. A brief walk in his garden confirms that his discrimination is working. So now I jokingly, when people ask, because they always do, what's your favorite Noguchi? And of course, I'm like a parent, I can't choose. I love everything. But here in a sort of early photo of the garden, you can see right at the center behind Noguchi and his friend is the Katsura tree. And you can see when Noguchi planted it, it was shorter than he was, which is about 5 feet tall. And this is what it looks like in our garden today. And I think if I had to pick one work that epitomizes Noguchi's abilities and the breadth of his understanding of what sculpture could be and should be and what he meant it to be, it's this tree, which he never saw top 6 feet, but is now the dominant element of our garden and creates the entire sense of our garden as another world, another land, a place outside space and time. It's all down to this tree. And Noguchi on some level knew that, but on some level also was just willing and able to let nature do what it would do.
So beautiful. Thank you, Dakin. What an incredible, really breathtaking exposure to the range and depth of his work. We are a little over time, but while we have you, I do want to just pass along a couple of questions that we've had. One is something you referred to very briefly, which was the internment that he endured during the Second World War when, of course, many Japanese Americans were confined in these internment camps, one of the really shameful episodes in American history. And we had a question from Lisa Viscardi, who's just read his essay, I Become a Nisei, where he talked about that. I know you also did an exhibition about this recently. So would you like to say anything about how his experience of internment affected his work, and also a little bit more about how design factors into that story?
Sure. It is a complicated story. So you used the word endured. Noguchi is the one person who's known to have voluntarily interned himself.
Yeah.
So he was not subject to internment because he was a resident of New York. Internment was martial law in the Western United States and only was imposed on residents of those states. So Noguchi chose to go in, and he did it ironically in a way because it was an opportunity to sort of be like Baron Haussmann in Paris or like Robert Moses in New York. The idea was, and he was working with the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's a long, complicated story. There was no bureaucracy to run the camps when they were envisioned. And they were all, in the government's infinite wisdom, it chose to put the internment camps on Native American reservations mostly, because they were large, isolated tracts of federal land that the government had total control over. And so they were viewed as safe. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs was the original authority. Then eventually it was turned over to the War Department. Remember, it wasn't the Defense Department at the time, it was the War Department. And they created a War Relocation Authority. So by the time Noguchi went into the camps, they had been designed and were being run like prison camps. But initially, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had managed them, had imagined creating them as humane and decent American societies, miniature societies as possible. That sounds ridiculous and utopian in all those absurd ways, and it is, but it would have obviously resulted in much better camps than were built because they were built as army barracks. They were tar paper shacks. They had zero insulation. It was 30 degrees at night and 120 degrees during the day. They were extraordinarily horrible conditions. So the idea is that Noguchi was going to go into the biggest camp, Poston, in Arizona, and design elements of the camp to be better. Services, gardens, playgrounds. He wanted to do a miniature golf course, which I read a whole essay about, a proper cemetery, because Issei in particular were not able to observe funeral rituals properly with the facilities they had available to them. So he had a whole bunch of ideas about how to basically turn every one of these camps into a miniature Paris, like a kind of American community ideal. And then none of that turned out to be possible because, again, they were being run as prison camps. And once they had him, they wouldn't let him go. But the whole idea of going in was a design idea. And his thought was that also he would institute arts programs to try to help the Issei and the Nisei reconnect with cultural traditions and invest in cultural traditions, even while they were being assimilated in these miniature ideal American communities that he intended to design. It's a totally demented concept in so many ways, but also shows the power of his idealism. And I think if you read that essay, which is extraordinarily beautiful, it begins with the statement, "To be hybrid anticipates the future," which is, that should be on every American dollar bill. That's as good as I have a dream. It is such a, that's a core American ideal, hybridity.
That maybe also is a great answer to another really super question we got from Ashwini Bhatt, the ceramic artist, who talks about her own experience seeing Noguchi's work and then asking whether you perceive Noguchi as a model who challenges cultural homogenization. Because of course he has all this cross-cultural energy in his work, but ultimately, do you see him as an avatar of heterogeneity and difference because of that embrace of hybridity?
It is a great question. I think it's irresolvable with respect to Noguchi. As I said, in the middle of the century, he really believed in assimilation, cultural assimilation in a lot of ways, as an American ideal, it's hard to tease out all the threads and get it just right, and then to make it seem right or feel right or sound right in contemporary context. But I think he believed in those individual cultural traditions remaining distinct within. I always think in terms of like clouds and like schools of fish or flocks of birds, that you want something that's greater than the sum of its parts, but within which everything is still individual, distinctly individual. And I think that's why mosaic is such a good metaphor. He was not a melting pot person. Obviously, I'm old enough that I grew up with that metaphor in school. And then it went to the salad or, to other metaphors for the American experience. But I think mosaic is a great idea and a great term that describes, if you think about that table, the prismatic table, every one of those colors is a pure color and they stay distinct, but within an overall design. But again, I'm supposing and I'm putting that on to Noguchi and using that as a metaphor, and that may be unfair. And again, his ideas between like 1942, when he was thinking about the camps, and the mid 80s, when his views had changed quite radically. He was anti-nuclear. He got in a fight with his best friend, Bucky Fuller, because Fuller believed that modernity should even come to places like Bali. And Noguchi thought that the best thing that could happen to Bali would be to be spared the modern world. So his ideas definitely changed and got more complex. I think what's good about him is that you can trust his instincts. We spend a lot of time skirting some of these more charged issues by just going directly back to Noguchi's words and letting him speak for himself. And I think when you dig into his views, that there's almost always a principle underlying them that still resonates and works, even now, as complicated as things have rightfully gotten.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end. And of course, looking at the garden, as you say that, you realize that that's another powerful metaphor of that position that he took, in which design and art obviously dissolve into a single aesthetic kind of shared experience. I do want to just let listeners know that we have another great design and dialogue, of course, coming up next. It'll be this Friday with my fellow host, Stephen Burks. And he's going to be talking to Johann Schwind, the prominent designer, futurist, works with BMW and many other concerns. So please come back on Friday for that at 11 Eastern time. And then we're actually going to leave you in a kind of interesting, cool, unusual way with this last project that Dakin has just been developing at the museum, which is called Distance Noguchi. So if you are about to have lunch, this might be a really good way to do that. So Dakin, can you explain what this is, and then just leave it playing as we finish up here?
So we tried to figure out how to do everybody going digital, all museums going digital during the quarantine. We resisted for a long time trying to figure out a way to do it that's sort of true to us. So we ended up shooting 80 hours of still video, super high resolution, 4K DCI with very, very high quality audio. So these are fixed position shots. The shortest are about an hour. The longest is about 11 hours. And it's a way for you just to come, be at Noguchi and just absorb the space. You can, because they're long, you can pick the time of day. So if you want to watch the sun come up, great. If you want to watch the sun go down, this is one of our digital features. So if you go to the website, go to Isamu Noguchi digital features, look for Distance Noguchi. And if you go down, you'll see there are 22 of these now. And they're kind of different set shots in different spaces at the museum. And what I've been doing is just letting one of these run on an iPad while I'm working. And it is very much like being in the space because the sound is so good. I think you can see her at the top. While we've been away, the birds have really taken over. Here's one. This has a robin in it. They love to bathe in the fountain. But they really have the run of the place. And you can hear that if you watch these videos.
It's so interesting to think of the Noguchi Museum as sort of unlike every other museum, which of course everybody feels like the lack of visitation is such a crisis during the lockdown, that in a way the Noguchi Museum is in its ideal state with only the birds there for company with the artwork.
Totally, it's so happy without us.
Doesn't need us.
It doesn't need us at all.
Yeah. Okay, well maybe if you want to just play one of those and we'll let that be our finale.
Yes, sure.
Dakin, thanks again so much for doing this with us. It's been an absolute pleasure and tremendous education as well. Really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I don't think you get the audio, unfortunately, the way this works, but please go do take a look at these.
Thanks again.
Thank you.